the SNP have never been able to answer the question, what do you do when Westminster says no? So the prospects, if you listen to people both publicly and privately in the SNP, they privately say, they've said in public, Humza Yousaf himself, that really we're talking about a much, much longer time frame for independence. So I wouldn't expect any time in the next few years to see an independence referendum, certainly not independence itself. Humza Yousaf, again, he comes and goes a bit in this issue. Only last weekend, I think, really, in a bid to please the activist, he talked about independence being within touching distance. It's not really in touching distance at all for anybody who commentates or observes this issue.
So, John, in the Times today, it outlines how Rishi Sunak failed to meet his 5 pledges. You've written about Humza Yousaf's less than fortunate 100 days. Is this a good summer for Keir Starmer?
I think it probably is. It's certainly been the case that in the polls in Scotland that Labour is doing particularly well. There was a poll in the Sunday Times a couple of weeks ago that showed really for the first time since 2010 that Labour was ahead in terms of the number of seats at Westminster that they could win of the SNP. Now, that would be a huge result if that happened. It would contribute to, no doubt, Starmer's majority if he were to get one at Westminster. But, you know, to defeat the SNP after all these years and put them into second place would be a big thing in Scotland.
A cynic might say that maybe the SNP is doing this somewhat on purpose, that, you know, if they end up out of government or if they end up with less seats, they can take time to bring in new blood, a chance to kind of give Scotland not a great place to Labour and then just take it back with a vengeance. Is there a chance that maybe that's what's happening?
I think you'd need to be particularly cynical, to be fair, to think that. The way I've described the SNP is that they are a party in transition and they're still searching for a transitional programme. And what I mean by that is that they've gone through themselves a gigantic change. All of the big figures really in the past, 20 years have started to move on. Nicola Sturgeon, the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, the party chief executive, Peter Murrell, who of course is married to Nicola Sturgeon. They've lost Ian Blackford at Westminster. Some of their thinkers, Mike Russell, for example, sort of departed the scene now. And what's actually happened is that the people who've replaced them are really people who, frankly, don't have the same ability, the same capability, and actually the same authority. And that's led the party into quite a difficult place for the past couple of years. The whole foundations on which the SNP has been built, it was been a tightly organised, hugely disciplined party, have all started really to come apart, to fall apart, and nobody seems to be able at the centre to get a grip of any of that and pull it all together. Now, those are the circumstances under which Humza Yousaf has taken over. I think he's been dealt a pretty bad hand, but I don't think he's played it particularly well. And I don't see how, in certainly a short period of time, they can start really to bring all of that together. They've also got huge problems in terms of their core policy, their core message. Only last weekend, they changed their policy on independence from that de facto referendum thing that Nicola Sturgeon spoke about to a policy with much more limited ambitions, where they say that they could go to Westminster after the election and really demand independence or a referendum on the basis of being the single biggest party in Scotland. It's kind of a bit half-baked, to be honest.
In the piece that you wrote today, you've alluded to some tension between Stephen Flynn, Ian Blackford's successor, and Humza Yousaf. How do you see that culminating?
I think one of the things that's really important, and it all plays into that backdrop that I've just described, is that the SNP, having been that really, really well disciplined party, is now riven with factions. We wrote a piece a couple of months ago where we spoke about 7 factions in the SNP. You really, after Nicola Sturgeon has gone, has seen a whole load of that authority disappear. So, for example, you've got a faction based around Kate Forbes, who lost the election very narrowly 100 days ago, in fact. You've got another wee faction that won 10% of the vote based around Ash Regan and some others. Flynn and people look as if they're operating really in a very detached way from Humza, and it's certainly the case that things are uncomfortable, at least if you talk to any insiders, really between them. A wee bit of anxiety, a wee bit of suspicion on both sides. Now, it may be they can pull all that together, but the difficulty is we are now finding as we go forward that the SNP's Westminster MPs in particular, they've got a huge concern, obviously, about what's happening. It's their seats who are up for grabs next year. If they get themselves into a situation, for example, where they lose possibly as many seats as they did in 2017, which was 21 of the then 59, then that's going to cause a lot of problems. I think the bigger problems, most of all, are for Humza going forward. You know, he will be depending on at least salvaging something next year from the election, even if they go backwards, in order to hold on to his position.
I mean, do you think Humza Yousaf can salvage it? Today, Ian, I'm going to pronounce this probably very wrong, but Ian McWhirter accused Humza Yousaf of having no vision and not leading. Do you think in the next 100 days that Humza Yousaf is able to salvage the SNP at all?
Look, this is again a huge problem for the SNP. They've been in office for nearly 6,000 days since 2007. That's a remarkable record under Alex Salmond and then under Nicola Sturgeon. It's clearly the case that Humza Yousaf is a weaker leader than both of those people. As I say, he's been dealt a bad hand, but he's not particularly done very well with that hand. I think he's got a huge problem, as I say. In the next period, they're going to have to be selecting a number of candidates. They've got a by-election coming up, possibly in Rutherglen, depending on what happens with a recall petition there. He's got to get through his party conference with a less than, I think, satisfactory position on independence that they now have. And then he's got to face the electorate next year. Now, if they go backwards, and some insiders are telling me this week that it's really a damage limitation exercise for them, if they go backwards, that's difficult for them. If Labour actually beats them into second place, as that panel-based poll in the Sunday Times says, that's even more difficult. And it is possible that they could lose seats to Labour at the next election, could come in second place, but even worse, they could actually lose some seats to the Tories. The big problem for the SNP and for Humza Yousaf is that there are a series of people in the electorate who quite openly support independence. They are people who would probably describe themselves as nationalists, but next year at the general election are likely to vote Labour because they see voting Labour as the best way of getting rid of the Tories. In a number of other constituencies, including in some Conservative constituencies, or Conservative constituencies where the Tories are currently in second place and could win, the fear of the SNP is that a number of their voters won't turn out. They won't go anywhere else. They might on this occasion abstain. And that means that the Tories could even win a small number of seats in Scotland next year. So none of that looks particularly good for Humza Yousaf. He's spending a lot of time talking to the party members, talking to the base. I think that's a lot of what he's going to be doing in a series of regional conferences over the summer. And then at the end of the next 100 days, he's got his annual autumn conference where he'll need to make a big pitch on the independence front, even though independence doesn't seem to be a big priority for people in Scotland at the moment.
Today, Ian Blackford had his exit interview with Matt Chorley, and he called Alex Salmond Marmite, and he said he needs to realize that his time has passed. I mean, we're in Westminster right now. We're seeing kind of the ghost of Boris Johnson keeps following Rishi Sunak around, and I guess same with Liz Truss. Is it time, do you think, for Alex Salmond just to kind of let Humza Yousaf get on with the job?
The SNP doesn't just have the ghost of Alex Salmond to contend with. The bigger ghost that the SNP have got at the moment is the ghost of Nicola Sturgeon. The gigantic person and issue that's really hanging over the SNP this summer is what happens in relation to Nicola Sturgeon, to her husband Peter Murrell, and to Colin Beattie, the former party treasurer. A number of weeks ago, as you'll know, they were all arrested and then released without charge. Nicola Sturgeon only a couple of weeks ago, and that is the big thing that's hanging over the SNP. We should see possibly sometime quite soon whether any of those people are going to get charged. And that's really something that we are waiting on over the coming weeks. It's not the ghost of Alex Salmond at the moment that Humza Yousaf really needs to worry about. It's the ghost of Nicola Sturgeon, and mostly because even although he's tried over the past 100 days to ditch some of the policies that were associated with Nicola Sturgeon, the difficulty that he's got is he was elected as the continuity candidate, and on each and every occasion he's been asked, he talks about Nicola Sturgeon being his friend of a great number of years. He says that she's the best politician in the last 10 years in Europe, and the other thing is he's failed to suspend her, even though she's been arrested, albeit arrested without charge, where a number of people have said that this is not the way that other colleagues have been treated in the past.
And finally, do you think that the SNP and the wider independence movement can recover from the damage that's happened thus far?
We've had, since 2014, a situation where the polls have ebbed and flowed in independence itself. Independence, despite the fact that SNP support's down, seems to be holding up in terms of the opinion polls pretty strongly, maybe 50-50, those in favour, those against. The big problem that they have is that both of the unionist parties, the Conservatives and Labour, say after the election they will not do anything on the independence front. They won't agree to a referendum. They certainly won't agree to independence. And the SNP have never been able to answer the question, what do you do when Westminster says no? So the prospects, if you listen to people both publicly and privately in the SNP, they privately say, they've said in public, Humza Yousaf himself, that really we're talking about a much longer time frame for independence. So I wouldn't expect any time in the next few years to see an independence referendum, certainly not independence itself. Humza Yousaf, again, he comes and goes a bit in this issue. Only last weekend, I think, really, in a bid to please the activist, he talked about independence being within touching distance. It's not really in touching distance at all for anybody who commentates or observes this issue.